So what really started the war? Well, Hitler had wanted a war from the very beginning. Since seizing power in 1933, over the next 6 years, Hitler slowly started to break the rules set out by the League of Nations. He raised an army that fast exceeded the 100,000 limit and soon rose above 1 million. Heavy production of tanks and aircraft started up all over the country. Now this made everyone else in Europe a little nervous, to say the least, but no one was really able nor willing to do anything about it. What could they do? No one wanted to start fighting again so soon after the First World War, and many of the countries in the League were struggling just to survive the Depression, let alone find the resources to go to war. So the League of Nations told Hitler he was violating the agreement and that he'd better stop. And Hitler simply ignored them. Now, if Germany was going to take on the League of Nations, they would need some help. Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, shared Germany's enthusiasm for a war. Like Germany, the Italians were suffering from a ruined economy, and the people wanted serious change. Mussolini, who had fought in the First War, promised that change and more. He believed they could recapture the splendor of the ancient Roman Empire. So Italy, together with Germany, formed an alliance, becoming the Axis. In the years leading up to the war, Hitler expanded his empire. He asked the League to hand over territories that he claimed belonged to Germany, and the League reluctantly gave in. They wanted to avoid all-out aggression, since Germany now had a very sizable army, one that technically wasn't supposed to be allowed to exist. Finally, on March 15, 1939, Germany occupied Czechoslovakia by moving a large armed force inside its border. Hitler announced to the world that it now belonged to Germany. At this point, all the other countries in Europe started getting a bit uncomfortable. This was the last straw. Back in Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain reassured his people that he was on his way to negotiate peace with Hitler. The last thing anyone in Britain wanted was another war. It had been only 20 years since the devastation of the last one, and its hell was still fresh in their minds. Meanwhile, Hitler found another ally, a somewhat unlikely one. Japan, like Italy, was on the winning side of World War I. Japan's Emperor, Hirohito, and his advisors felt they weren't rewarded enough in the ending settlement of the First War, believing they deserved greater compensation. In recent years, Japan had been advancing fast and becoming a bit of a superpower. But, other than Japan itself, they only really had a few other islands in the Pacific to call their own, unlike the mighty British, whose empire had territories across the globe. Japan felt it was their time to take their own empire. They allied with Germany and signed the Anti-Communist Pact. With Japan now on his side, Hitler drew up plans to invade Poland. Poland had alliances with both Britain and France. If it were to be invaded, it would almost surely mean war. Fearing Poland would be Hitler's next step, Prime Minister Chamberlain asked Russia for help. He spoke with Joseph Stalin, communist dictator of Russia. Stalin was a very odd man. Unlike most dictators or leaders, Stalin was a terrible speaker and had very little charisma. However, he knew how to manipulate situations and intimidate or sabotage other people. The negotiations failed, leaving Chamberlain to return to Britain empty-handed. Soon after, Britain was horrified to learn that Stalin signed a pact officially allying with Germany. Wait, what? Russia, the communist nation, allying with Germany and Japan, the two countries that had just signed the Anti-Communist Pact? As crazy as it sounds, yes, I'm sure this really troubled Stalin, but he felt he had little choice in the matter. Russia was stuck in between Germany and Japan geographically, And if Stalin had allied with France and Britain, Russia could have been attacked from both sides at once. To Stalin, the Allies just seemed like less of a threat all the way on the other side of Europe. Russia siding with Germany was a terrible situation for the rest of Europe. Now Poland was surrounded completely by hostile armies. World War II was about to officially begin. The sides have been drawn up: Russia, Japan, Italy, and Germany against Great Britain, France, and technically the ill-equipped Poland. The German army would lead the attack into Poland along with the Russians. Japan would start capturing British colonies in the Pacific. Italy wasn't ready to go into battle yet, and were taking time to get their ducks in a row. Blitzkrieg. On September 1st, 1939, Germany and Russia invade Poland. Britain and France have no choice but to stand up to the aggressors and declare war on the Axis. This was a problem because Prime Minister Chamberlain had been so convinced he could achieve peace that he hadn't prepared the military for a war. The French troops only held defensive positions in Europe at the time, and it would be a month before Britain could even get their troops onto the mainland. Germany wasted no time taking advantage of the Allies' paralyzed state. They utilized the Blitzkrieg to conquer mainland Europe. Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war, was the name given to the tactics of using tanks to make fast, offensive pushes that covered great distances in a short amount of time. This had never been done before in war, namely because the tank had only recently been perfected. Huge amounts of land could be taken, and troops could be surrounded or overwhelmed very quickly. The defending troops were used to fighting slow-moving infantry lines or occasionally charging cavalry on horseback, not these motorized death machines with cannons. In just 10 days, Poland was decimated. Although a sizable amount of their soldiers managed to escape to fight alongside the British, the casualties were terrible. The German army was well trained and used thousands of men and tanks to roll over the outdated and ill-equipped Polish soldiers. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had free reign of the skies and bombed the country mercilessly. Now Hitler wanted to conquer France. If he could, the German army would have almost complete control of mainland Europe, something that was unimaginable to the world just a few months prior. However, in October 1939, Hitler halted his westward offensive. He didn't want to be fighting battles on too many different fronts simultaneously. A large portion of German troops were still in Poland. As well, terrible rainy weather had hit Europe and turned much of the landscape into mud. Hitler was forced to postpone his invasion of France until conditions improved. He couldn't exactly wage a lightning war if his tanks were slowly slogging through mud. So for the time being, he turned his direction and focus elsewhere. Thanks to this, the Allies had some very valuable time to catch their breath and make preparations. Over the next few months, Germany would take control of Norway and Denmark. The Battle of the Atlantic. While things in Europe ground almost to a halt, the war was accelerating in the Atlantic. Great Britain was a fairly small island considering its population. To run its powerful military machine and feed all of its people, Britain needed to import millions of tons of food and supplies every year. Most of these shipments came by boat from North America and the Mediterranean. Hitler knew that if he could stop the shipment of foods and supplies from getting into Britain, the Germans would easily be able to force Britain into surrendering. After all, you can't fight a war for very long when you're unarmed and starving. But how would the Germans do it? The Atlantic was kind of a big place, and the British arguably had the most powerful navy in the world at the time. Germany's solution was the U-boat. The U-boat was half ship, half submarine. It could travel very fast on the surface of the water and then submerge to become an invisible killer. but could it be any real threat to the British? At the time, Germany only had a handful of U-boats and could only launch them from ports out of northern Germany. This meant, to get to the Atlantic and start sinking Allied supply ships, they would have to take a long detour up and around the British Isles. They couldn't cut through the English Channel since it was quite shallow, well guarded, and mined heavily. On October 14, 1939, just after Poland was conquered, a single U-boat snuck up into the Allied base at Scapa Flow in Scotland and sunk the giant HMS Royal Oak battleship without being detected at all. It slunk away and safely made it back to Germany. 833 British Navy men died.
This was the catastrophic threat the U-boats posed, and the reason that Hitler really started to believe they could starve Britain. In Germany, back home, the crewmen of these U-boats had kind of a hero's welcome wherever they went. They had sort of a elite status.
To manage the U-boat fleet in the Atlantic, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz. He was charged with making sure the U-boats made the long journey west of Britain and sunk as many Allied ships as possible. They started getting very good at it. More worrisome for the British was that their navy had almost no way to track down and destroy these U-boats. Supply ships were being lost daily, and the Allies seemed powerless to prevent it. So it was ordered that all supply vessels were now to travel in protected convoys. At all times, these convoys would be surrounded by the Navy. This helped a lot, since now, for a U-boat to attack a supply vessel, they would have to directly contend with the British Navy.
The convoy system worked for a time, but more and more U-boats were being produced, and they were getting better and better at making accurate torpedo strikes from complete stealth. Britain was losing ships and food faster than they could replace them.
France. May 1940, 8 months after Hitler invaded Poland, nice weather returned to Western Europe. Hitler now began his invasion of France, and on the very same day, Winston Churchill replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of Great Britain. France was one of the major powers in the world at this point. They had suffered greatly in the First World War, and to deter anyone, namely Germany, from ever attacking France again, they constructed the Maginot Line. What was the Maginot Line? A long series of concrete fortifications with artillery built into them, stretching across the entire French-German-Swiss border. Vast minefields spread for miles in front of the stronghold, and below the line lay subterranean tunnels and storerooms which housed men, ammunition, food, and more. France was confident in their ability to stop the German blitzkrieg. It could be argued they really hadn't worried too much about Hitler's military actions, since they were safe behind their fortified border. Enter General Erwin Rommel, commander of the German invasion of France. He was a brilliant tactician, leader, and one of the most important German commanders during the entire war. Rommel ordered his tanks to just avoid the Maginot Line completely. They drove north into Belgium, attacking a weak point in the French lines, and entered France through the Ardennes forest. The French thought the Germans wouldn't attempt to go through the large forest, and thus hadn't reinforced the area. Soon, German forces had completely surrounded the Maginot Fortress and cut it off from the rest of France, making the fortification and the thousands of French soldiers defending it almost instantly useless. The Germans charged deep into France, and even had a lot of help from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, who were able to just fly over the Maginot Line.
For France, this was the oversight of oversights. Although technically by going through Belgium, the Germans violated international law, but clearly they couldn't care less.
Nothing could be done to stop the German advance, and soon they captured Paris. The French and British soldiers could not stand up to the swift and powerful attacks from the German army, the Wehrmacht, and were forced to keep retreating at a staggering pace. Anyone who couldn't fall back fast enough was captured or killed. At the end of May, After only a few weeks, the Nazis had tiptoed over the impassable French border, charged their way into Paris, and battered the Allied forces, funneling a huge pocket of them to the port of Dunkirk. Now, with their backs to the English Channel, the Allied soldiers could retreat no further. While this was all going on, Hitler had ordered the neutral Netherlands, then Holland, to be invaded. After some horrific bombing, the Dutch surrendered after a couple of days, allowing the country to quickly become occupied by German forces. It's time for Hitler's Big Mistakes, starring Adolf Hitler. Throughout the war, Hitler made several critical errors in judgment that had huge ramifications on the result of the war. Mistake number 1. With the Allies about to be wiped off the face of the continent, German intelligence received reports that a counterattack was being organized by the British. In the face of this news, Hitler had a big decision to make. Either press on and capture basically every Allied soldier in Europe, or halt his unstoppable force and wait to see what happens with the possible counterattack.
Granted, a big counterattack could have complicated Hitler's military positioning, but nothing could have harmed their advance in any real way. Luckily for the British, Hitler was sometimes as smart as he was handsome. He chose to stop the advance on the troops trapped at Dunkirk.
This little window of hesitation gave the British almost 8 extra days in which they could evacuate their stranded soldiers. They wasted no time sending ships, buggies, and even fishing boats across the English Channel. Around 850 ships of all shapes and sizes ferried soldiers to safety. In all, 340,000 men were saved from Dunkirk. Another 220,000 managed to be evacuated from northwestern France as well.
If all of these veterans had been captured, the Allies might have been so handicapped they could have lost the war right then. But they didn't, and hence, this event was known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. But this miracle didn't negate Hitler's territorial control, which, at this point, was basically all of mainland Europe.
As well, the Germans had taken more than 1 million Allied soldiers prisoner in just the last 3 weeks, while only sustaining 60,000 casualties themselves. Not long after Dunkirk, on June 22nd, France signed an official surrender. They were no longer fighting in the war. The Axis now only needed to finish off the small island of Britain, and then no one could stand in their way.